Welcome to Alliance's breakfast panel, a panel that we do each quarter to reflect on the themes discussed in the issue. I'd like to start by thanking CAF, our long-standing friends and partners, for hosting us here today. I'm Charles Keidan, I edit Alliance. Alliance, as many of you know, is a magazine that covers philanthropy globally. Our aim is to help with the development of philanthropy by giving it the attention and scrutiny it deserves, and I hope you feel we do justice to that mission through our magazine and website and coverage, and we're always seeking to improve and always welcome your feedback. The objective of the Breakfast Club's discussions are to illuminate the topic of our special feature, and today that's on the relationship between philanthropy and the media. I don't know whether it's apt or ominous that we're here at the CAF offices right by Fleet Street to debate the topic of the future of the media, but we'll be looking today at the key issues, trends and controversies, drawing on the special feature that is on your chairs. As with all of our discussions, there'll be some brief comments from our panel for about the first 45 minutes or so, and then we'll be opening up to a wide-ranging and hopefully inclusive discussion involving as many perspectives from you as possible. The hashtag for today is philanthropy media, so please feel free to tweet if you think there's anything interesting to tweet today. So to introduce a special feature in our panel, the feature looks at why a strong, well-resourced media is at the heart of a free society, which in turn is essential for the well-being of democracy. That's the proposition. If that proposition is true, and that media matters, how can philanthropy play a role in promoting journalism in the public interest, build new models, and restore trust in an age of disinformation, fake news, and in some countries, creeping authoritarianism? And of course, that should be important to philanthropy, because its own survival will depend on the well-being of civil society and democracy. And yet philanthropy's role is still emerging in this space. According to some of the figures in the magazine, $1.3 billion was contributed by philanthropy to the media between 2011 and 2015, which is a significant amount, but only a very small proportion of overall philanthropic spending. And notably, over 90% of it came from and went to the United States. So those are some of the questions that led to conversations that Miguel, Nienke and I had actually in Turin a couple of years ago, where this issue was on the agenda of a philanthropic convening. So it's really good a couple of years on to all be here today. So to briefly introduce our panellists, on my far right over here is Miguel Castro, the Senior Officer of the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, and also guest editor of this special feature. And it's really thanks to Miguel that we have the range and depth of the contributors you'll see in the issue. And it's been a very interesting experience working together to develop the themes that you'll see in the magazine and hear about today. And next to me here on my right is Nienke Venema, who's the director of the Democracy and Media Foundation based in the Netherlands and is a leading funder of public interest journalism. And it's also thanks to Nienke that this issue was free to read online, making sure that we could amplify the debate even further. And on my left, it's a pleasure to introduce Belinda Goldsmith, who's the editor-in-chief of Thomson Reuters Foundation. It's a corporate foundation and philanthropic arm of Thomson Reuters, which, as many of you will know, is the world's leading, one of the world's leading news providers. Before I start, I just wanted to briefly mention, in the preparation I was doing today, some of the principles of Thomson Reuters Foundation, based in 1941, established, and they really seem striking in the context in which we are all operating. And they are listed, I'm only going to read two of them. The integrity, independence and freedom from bias of Thomson Reuters should at all times be preserved. And that Thomson Reuters shall supply unbiased and reliable news services to newspapers, news agencies, broadcasters and other medias with whom Thomson Reuters have contracts. And I think those premises from another era are actually very relevant today, and it just seems like it's worth just noting them as an anchor for some of the conversations that we're going to have. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Miguel, who's going to give a short overview of the special feature, the key issues and topics that he felt needed to be raised, how he chose the contributors, what stood out for him, and where philanthropy may go from here. And Miguel's going to speak for about 10 minutes. Thank you, Miguel.
So hi everyone, Miguel Castro, Senior Officer with a team in the Gates Foundation called the Global Media Partnerships, where we we manage all of the long-term relationships with media organizations, mostly through grant making. So the reason why this became such an exciting project for me was that, as many others, I felt like philanthropy and media and journalism, they need each other. And the principle that working together, we can really make a difference to reach each other's goal and see how we can develop that concept, socialize it, bring more people on board. And I want to read just one sentence from one of the articles in the magazine from Gustavo Gorriti.
Before you, if you speak up, just for the benefit of anyone at the back.
Speak up a little bit, yeah. So Gustavo Gorriti, he's the executive director of an investigative reporting outlet out of Peru, who's been single-handedly being the sort of the watchdog of society in Peru for the last 2 or 3 decades. He says that there is a great disparity between the consensus of the importance of free investigative journalism for the health of democracy and the very small percentage of philanthropy allowed to support it. And he says that without really knowing what is the scale of the global philanthropy world, or what is the amount of foundations working on this, or how far this space goes. It's just his own personal experience of the investigative reporting that is necessary for a healthy democracy in Peru, very hard circumstances for over 2 or 3 decades. And I've been always taken aback by the fact that there is the size, and Charles gave a few numbers, and maybe we can dig into those numbers a little bit more later on, but the size and distribution of the global philanthropy and how much of that goes to media and journalism, there is massive disparity that we need to address, especially those of us who work in the media space or people working in the journalism industry I've always wondered why, and a little bit of what we want to do in this magazine is to sort of dig into those questions to see if we can figure it out, what's happening, why philanthropy support for journalism is so small comparatively. There is a couple of definitions. Well, the definition of philanthropy, I don't think we need to go through it. But when we refer to media in here, we mostly refer to the transmission of news and information. And this is important because a lot of the figures that we will be talking about in here, and we threw out like the $1.3 billion that annually between 2011 and 2015 have gone to media. It encompasses a little bit more than the transmission of news and information. But even beyond that, those definitions right now on how those two worlds, the world of philanthropy and the world of media, collide right now have been stretched to a level in which we need to rethink what they mean. So recently, Lauren Powell Jobs, through her philanthropy, the Emerson Collective, bought a 51% controlling, dominating stake on the Atlantic, and they've done it as a philanthropic endeavor. So it's a question. Sorry. It's a question, and it's a relevant debate if that is the truth. Is it truly philanthropy or not? Even more so, Jeff Bezos buys the Washington Post, and there's still some people that is considered philanthropy for them because the survival of the Washington Post depended on that investment. And sorry. Also, the I'm just out of the and my my throat is not clear yet. So the definition of journalism has also been stretched beyond recognition over the last decade, and especially over the last few years with the arrival of social media. Now journalism is presented in so many different ways that the transmission of news and information happens through many different platforms, actors, and especially when it touches the world of philanthropy. It's a definition that is not recognizable to what we were talking about. Journalism was only 5 years ago. If you add to that the context of the political environment and the social and political events that have happened over the last, especially 2 years, with hundreds of websites routinely distributing misinformation and social bots automating the programming of the distribution of fake news, then you have a set of processes, most of them political and election-related processes that have been affected, at least, and some of them even damaged from a democratic or liberal point of view. So philanthropy and media find themselves at the core of that. And a little bit of what we want to also say here is how philanthropy is reacting very slowly and in the most traditional ways that we have done. I mean, in Europe, mostly the reaction is either governments or institutions, and a couple of examples from the philanthropic world. But in the US, where most of the philanthropy support for journalism comes, again, has been very slow. As we speak, yesterday and today, is probably the largest and most comprehensive approach to how philanthropy is addressing misinformation and disinformation is happening in USC in California. Is the Digital Disinformation and Political Polarization of Scholars convening is hosted by Hewlett and Ford, and everyone that is working in any of those many spaces that have to do with information disorder, from misinformation to disinformation to filter bubbles, echo chambers, fake news, you name it, and the list of topics is massive, are getting together. And we've reacted in a way that we do very often. That is, we all work with the same people in sort of, that's the Social Media and Political Participation Lab out of New York University, Oxford Computational Program, Computational Propaganda Project out of Oxford University with Philip Howard. So the same 2 or 3 groups are getting most of the attention from all of the donors. So there's a lot of, all of this to say, there's a lot of learning and a lot of thinking of how to react. And journalism needs to react as well, obviously. Journalism needs to figure it out, what is the value of what we do to the societies that we serve, because journalism has been calling attention to all of these problems for hundreds of years. And a couple of years ago, Anya Schifrin produced a book called Global Macracking, and James Hamilton wrote a book called Democracy Detectives, a couple of really long investigations into the value of journalism to provide social change over the last 100 years. And all of this with the massive transformation in the media industry that comes with the digital disruption and the technological revolution when internet and social media arrive. And more importantly, even now with artificial intelligence and robotics and big data, which have that translated into, well, first the disruption of the funding model, but also is the sort of the breeding ground for the filter bubbles on the echo chambers that happen out of the automation of the relationship between an audience and a platform. A second really transformation has been, and for me more important, and we point at that in the magazine a couple of times, is the media industry has a little bit lost the North Star, and that commitment that journalism has always had to the transformation of the societies that it serves, and it's been driven by the first crisis that we just mentioned, which is the disruption of the funding model. And parallel to all of that, but also incredibly connected, is the decline of credibility of the media industry across the board, in all geographies, in all languages, and right now in many places, as measured by institutions like the Reuters Institutes or Edelman, etc., the credibility of the media industry and journalism in general is really poor. So we have to address that as well. I make a point, and I personally, it's one of my champion campaigns is around audience and impact, and we have a little bit of that in the magazine, and it's time. I think it's time for the media industry and for journalism to pay more attention to the impact that we have, how to measure it, how to understand audiences, and all of these are the core of what journalism's play is in society, which is service audiences with news that you can use. And not just a commercial endeavor, but a transformational purpose that has to do with how to overcome all of these crises that we've listed that the media industry is addressing. And ultimately this issue is trying to highlight all of the sort of the structural concerns that are in that relationship between media organizations and philanthropy. And we have, I'm going to name again Gustavo Gritti, because his piece was pretty extraordinary as well, into pointing at some of those challenging observations about the relationships between philanthropy and journalism, and coming from someone who has received support from philanthropists for almost 2 decades. He calls that relationship, he calls funders enlightened despots, is that how he calls it? Yeah. So in a very articulate and eloquent, I mean, if you haven't read that article, that is so beautifully written that it's worth your time. But he highlights that relationship that Nienke will talk about, because she's been also very insistent about journalists being very aware of that role, power dynamics in between journalists and philanthropists. And we have as well pieces from Tom Rosenthal, who's the director of the American Press Institute, and Barbara Hans, editor of Spiegel Online, on describing where the opportunities and the frames and the boundaries of those relationships with from journalists with philanthropy and donors. And it's extremely interesting that it comes from Barbara Hans for several reasons. First, because in Germany there is very little to no tradition of philanthropy support to journalism until literally the last couple of years, where a couple of big endeavors like Charities have been funded fully for philanthropy, and another outlet here and there are starting to get. But the debate is happening right now. So setting that framework from Barbara Hans is been one of the most interesting pieces in the magazine, as opposed to Tom Rosenthal and the American Press Institute, who have been proselytizing about the need of defining those relationships in the most ethical ways for a long time. And those relationships are, I mean, we in the Gates Foundation, we adhere very clearly to 3 principles that mostly everyone agrees. There are transparency of that relationship, editorial independence of the editorial and creative independence of the media and the journalists, and ultimately as well integrity. So it's integrity in the sense of the content and the work of the journalists has to be relevant, timely, evidence-based, and of quality. Because I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that not all media deserves the support of philanthropy, and not all philanthropic causes deserve the support of journalism. So there is a filtering process that both worlds have to go through, and we need to just understand each other and doing it in the frame of a set of rules that is clearly defined and is understandable. And finally, I think if there is one conclusion that we aim at this collection of articles, is that media should welcome change and embrace that role that it has in delivering social change. But at the same time, philanthropy needs to step up and understand, as Charles said at the beginning, that without a functioning media, civil society collapses. And from a more practical point of view, so we have very aspirational goals in philanthropy, so if we want to achieve them, we're better off if we do it with the support of journalism and the media space. And that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Thank you, Miguel. And your closing comments about functioning media, civil society is in danger, just maybe underscores how high the stakes are for both philanthropy and the media. So it's very timely to be kind of shining a spotlight on those questions. For Gustavo Gritti's piece, it's on page 48 of the magazine. Would, as Miguel said, encourage you to read that, as well as, of course, his overview, which touches on many of the themes that he referenced. So thank you, Miguel. Now just to pass over to Nienke, who will be talking a bit more about models of ownership and why they matter in the context of funding the media.
Thanks, Charles, and thank you for having me. Now that Miguel has set the somewhat overwhelming context, that is the complex ecosystem that media is in and the various transformations and disruptions that it has gone through, I hope I can sort of move you with me to a more practical talk about models, but also help you a little bit, or tell you a little bit about what my foundation does and why it does it, because I think that might be inspirational. But before I do, Miguel talked about audience engagement and impact. I hope you don't mind, Charles, that I ask how many funders of media are in the room right now? One. How many foundations are in the room that are interested in potentially funding media? Okay, one very careful hand in the back, and another very careful hand over there. Or no, no.
Sorry.
And so, are there many people in the room who receive funding that work in media or journalism? Okay, so it's just interesting for me to see who my audience is, that I can sort of tailor what I'm going to say to that. All right, so I'm the director of the Democracy and Media Foundation, and I think what's cool to know about the foundation and what's interesting and potentially even inspiring to know about the foundation is that, much like yours, it was set up in the 40s, in 1944, but in my case by the then men who had also set up a resistance movement newspaper in the Netherlands during the German occupation. And many of their friends at that point in 1944 had died, and also their acquaintances and their colleagues had died trying to bring information to the public during occupation. But there was light at the end of the tunnel. They thought the war would end soon, and they wanted to preserve their paper. Now, in this paper, they had wrote somewhat elaborate op-eds about why the totalitarian regime had got such a grip on the Netherlands in the 40s. And they mentioned three rather important sort of pillars that they thought were the cause of this. And one of them was verzuiling, which is in English translates to pillarization, which pretty much means filter bubbles in a somewhat more complex ways, people only talking to people that are of their religion or of their political conviction. So they were concerned about this and the fact that people therefore weren't talking to each other. They were concerned about, what's the right word for this? I sound like I know my English, but believe me, I haven't been here for a long time, so I struggle. The other one was political apathy, so the fact that people care more about football than they care about what's going on in government. And the third one was commercial ownership of media and what that does to the quality of the public debate and to the quality of journalism. So they were concerned about these three things and concerned about many other things, but they write about these three rather elaborately. And they set up this foundation with two missions. The first was to be the sole non-profit owner of this newspaper after the war ended. And the second was to do something about these three problems. So here I am in 2018, the director of this foundation with this rather daunting mission in a rather daunting time. And when I had my interview for this job, I spoke to a very engaged person called Ad Stope. He was on the board at that moment, and he said, you know, so many foundations are supporting causes outside of Europe and supporting media outside of Europe, but really, what are their causes worth if they are not also supporting media, if we don't have a critical and independent free press who, A, brings the information about the topics that they care so deeply about to the public, holds truth to power. But what are we without the media? What are we without journalism? And shouldn't funders in Europe be thinking a little bit more about funding journalism and media? So that's what he told me when I was sitting there in my interview, and I thought, well, you know, fair point. I was quite nervous. I really wanted the job. But I took it to heart, and in 2016, he and I and the Media Development Investment Fund, I don't know if you know them, but they're very good, and OZEF, organised a gathering for foundations interested in the quality of the public debate. Now, we were interested in what they wanted to do with perhaps journalism and media, but of course there is no quality of the public debate without journalism and media. I was dead nervous because I thought nobody would show up. People did thankfully show up. Brexit, unfortunately, helped us a little bit with the urgency of the situation. Of course, there was a conversation going on at that moment, especially in Britain, but also in the rest of Europe, about the role of journalism in this referendum. We came together in October 2016, and of course we all know what happened in November 2016, and ever since then the conviction that journalism and media are very, very important, but also in sort of dangerous waters, that there is all the context that Miguel just sketched that I won't repeat about misinformation and post-truth and God knows what, and basically we need to stand up and do something. But what? it's daunting. Lots of people then signed up to the New York Times. Lots of people donated to the Committee to Protect Journalists or donated to ProPublica or other sort of news media. There is a shift in how people are thinking about media and journalism, in the sense that it's no longer something that you pay for, and if you don't like it, you stop paying for it. But no, actually, this is something I need to support. So there is a shift in the way people are thinking about media and journalism, and unfortunately this shift is necessary and rather urgent, that we are all aware of the fact that if we do not have independent journalism and media, we will not have an open society, an open democratic society. So in that sense, things have, for sadly bad reasons, been looking up for philanthropy in media, illustrated by the fact that Miguel and I were both in 3 gatherings over the last 2 weeks with founders potentially interested in funding media. So that's a good thing, I think. Miguel has been, the biggest advocate in trying to talk to foundations about this topic and trying to sort of help bring understanding about the relevance of this. And together we've also been trying to structure it, because it's hard. You mentioned it already. There is distrust not only for the public to the media, but also between philanthropy and media. Now, journalists don't like people that give money, and rightly so. And foundations don't like funding people or organizations that are unpredictable and that they don't know how to measure the impact of. So there's a real sort of route in front of us where we try to structure and help bring understanding to philanthropy and media as to how to be able to support each other, because we need to very badly. That was my plea. I also need to talk about models, and Miguel also said that I need to talk about power dynamics. I'm not sure if I'll do all of that, but I'm happy to answer questions on it if you're interested in it.
Talk models, and I'll have a question about power for all of you.
Great. So models, so what we do at the Democracy and Media Foundation, we, by the way, also fund activism and movement lawyers, so it's not just journalism, but what we do is we're still a shareholder of media. I'll come to that. But we're also a fund, so we have a budget. It's very small, 2 million a year. I thought that was huge when I started the job, but it turns out to be tiny. But what we do is there's 3 structures through which we help media. One is that we are convinced that we need to help journalism and media through this disruptive period. And this disruptive period might be forever, so we have to sort of reflect on this every few years. But for now, the media that's good, and the sort of journalists that are working together, the consortiums that are out there, need to be supported. So we institutionally fund various organizations, various journalists for doing their work. Now, we invest in the journalism that doesn't make a profit. Investigative journalism and beat journalism is never really going to be profitable, because it takes hours and hours and hours of work, and quite frankly, people don't pay that much to read journalism anymore. So we invest in good investigative journalism, and we fund experiments and also some research, not as much as a lot of other foundations do, but we do also fund experiments, because to get through this disruptive period, one needs to try to find out different ways to relate to it, and different business models and different audience engagement models, and loads of them fail, and as a funder that's hard, because you want to be able to present a success, but a success can also be, we tried this, it didn't work, this is what we learned from it. So these are models of funding journalism, and then the last one I'll get to, and then I'll stop talking, is ownership models. If you've read my little piece in this magazine, you might already know what I'm going to tell you, and I apologize beforehand, but we believe at the Democracy and Media Foundation that it's very important who are the shareholders of a media company, because in the end, who makes the decision about whether or not you're going to compromise your independence, or whether or not you're going to, go to more native advertising, or perhaps, do more clickbait. In the end, it's the shareholders that set the parameters for that. And we are a 40% shareholder of the biggest media company in the Netherlands. We didn't do that necessarily deliberately, because we used to be the sole owner of it, and we've sold the majority of the shares. We now have a minority of the shares, it's 40%, and we have what we call a golden share, or a priority share. And what's interesting about this is the following. You do not have to do what the Emerson Collective did, become a majority shareholder of a media company, although I commend them for it. You do not have to make day-to-day business decisions if that's not your expertise, or if that's not something that your foundation requires. To be able to safeguard the independence of journalism and of media of a company, because we have a priority share. So we're a minority shareholder, we sit at the shareholder table, and we have a priority share, and this priority share gives us veto rights. So the moment that we have any evidence that either the independence of one of the daily newspapers that is connected to this company is being compromised, or that one of these daily papers is to be shut down, closed, or sold, we have the right to veto that decision. Now, it's all great to have the right to veto, but if the company then doesn't invest in the paper anymore, where does that leave you? Well, we also have the deep pockets to back up such a decision and to try to help find a new owner for one of these dailies, if that's what we feel would be necessary. So this is a very ancient model, goes back to the 40s. To me, that's a long time ago anyway. But we've now transferred this model to a more modern company called The Correspondent. The Correspondent, does anybody know about The Correspondent by any chance? It's a Dutch online journalism platform that's been crowdfunded in 2014. It's been very successful. And we helped in the beginning, because to become very successful, one also needs the funding to do certain things that then bring an audience to you and that gives you a good website and all of that. So we helped fund them by taking equity and giving them a loan. So we're a 5% shareholder of The Correspondent, or 10% by now. And we've done this again for their American endeavor. They've also gone to the United States to try, together with Jay Rosen, to see if this would work in the United States as well. We also have the same priority share there, with only 10% of shares, so you don't need that much. But it's the same model. And the reason The Correspondent loves that we've done this and have asked us to do this, and not asked for a grant or a loan, is that they feel that is something Miguel touched upon already. Trust is so important right now, and trust in media is so low that if, as a media platform, as a media company, you can say, well, look, we are our own shareholder, but we have one other shareholder, and that shareholder safeguards our independence. So they're independent of us, and they safeguard our independence. That's another way also of showing your audience that the journalism that you produce is quality journalism rather than journalism solely aimed at becoming commercially successful. So I think that was what I had to say about that.
And I can see, given that what you're investing in, the trust that therefore is implied in what you do makes stakes high for you in terms of your role and the responsibility to be a custodian of the reputation of your organisation because of the impact of its work on others. So,
yes, thank you.
Thank you, Nienke. And for more from Nienke, you can read on page 54 her piece, and 52 and 53 about some other models that are being developed. So there is a section on the media ownership piece, which is actually quite important to this overall debate. So thank you very much for that very clear exposition. I'd like to now turn to Belinda, who will talk for about 8 minutes or so just about her vantage point on the work. I've read out the Thomson Reuters Trust Principles. Be interested to know how you put them into practice,
Sure.
the programs you run on media training and development, and what you see as the key questions in this debate.
Sure, okay, thanks
Pleasure
very
to
much.
have you with us.
Great to be here this morning. I'm coming from a completely different perspective, I think, than Miguel and Nienke on this, although you're going to hear the same themes of we're a unique position at the moment, unique situation, audience, credibility and impact are three major topics to look at. On the trust principles, they date back to World War II, when Reuters was the world's biggest information and financial news provider, not so much finance then, and the British government was trying to put pressure on Reuters to be used as a propaganda tool during the war. Reuters said no, set down the trust principles, and they are now enshrined in the company and our cultures ever since. Occasionally, this becomes very sort of controversial. After 9/11, for example, one of the banned words at Reuters is terrorist. We don't brand an organisation a terrorist organisation or say it's an act of terrorism. And of course, after 9/11, when we refused to say it's a terrorist attack, the US administration was not happy. So it caused a debate, but we try and think that, you know, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. We try and make sure all our words are not loaded, they are impartial, they are independent, even with pressure on you like that. So what I want to do today, quickly, in my 8 minutes, I thought I had 10, so I'm going to talk really fast.
And I might have stolen two of you, I'm sorry.
Is say what I do, why I'm sitting here, how media and philanthropy can benefit each other, and give some concrete examples of that, because I'm very much at the coalface. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. I run a team of nearly 50 journalists globally and 150 freelancers, covering what we call the underreported stories. Those are issues like women's rights, LGBT rights, humanitarian crises, poverty, trafficking in slavery, property rights. These are things that a lot of the mainstream media don't spend time doing. We're lucky. We've got the global reach and the reputation of Reuters. Reuters is one of the most trusted news organisations there is. And this is so important in these days now of fake news and disinformation. It's something that we protect fiercely. We avoid loaded words, we avoid jargon, and what we do at the foundation is we try and tell stories the most compelling way. And that means human stories. It's about people. All these issues, poverty, inequality, discrimination, it's about real lives. So my job as a journalist is to make sure we find those people and illustrate these stories through real stories. We do this, of course, through journalism, and at the foundation we also do it through training. All the stories my team produce go on the Reuters International Wire, which reaches an estimated 1 billion people a day. I love that number. I don't know where they get it from, but it's a great number. But we also train journalists in countries around the world to cover the issues that we care about. So that ensures there's coverage at national and regional levels as well. So we're trying to attack it from all different levels. We look at, then of course, as Miguel mentioned, it's a case of metrics. How do you know what we're doing is actually working? And M&E is now such a buzz term, I think, for all organisations, probably people in this room as well. You have to prove what you're doing is being successful. We know our stories get huge play internationally. We're on Reuters Wire, of course they do. We know our social media engagement is good, and that's great. But what I really like of our metrics is impact. And often impact is the anecdotes about stories. So, for example, we did a story early this month about a pilot project giving digital ID cards to stateless Rohingya in Bangladesh because they can't access any services. This pilot project with the ID cards enabled them to access banking and education services. We did a story about it, we spoke to the people who were getting these cards and the difference it's made. Within 24 hours, the Murtala Muhammad Foundation from Nigeria decided, sorry, not, it wasn't them, it was, I can't remember who the funding was, sorry, that's a different one, decided to fund this project. So they're now getting money to fund this pilot. Fantastic impact. We didn't set out to get the funding, but just highlighting a really good thing that's happening can lead to change. So awareness, discussion can lead to change. So how can media and philanthropy benefit each other? Well, I think as Miguel mentioned, you know, what philanthropy needs is an audience. There's hundreds of websites out there, lots of them are putting out misinformation or wrong news. You need an audience that is already there, that's already listening to what you're saying, because otherwise you're not going to reach people. And talking to the converted is going to make no difference. You're trying to reach a wider audience. But to have that, you need credibility. You need to make sure that the messenger is a credible source, and that's why we're seeing now the New York Times. Its subscriptions went up 500,000 last year to about 2.3 million. Financial Times, by the end of last year, their subscriptions were up to 900,000. It's enormous, the last year, the increase in subscriptions. As we said, whether it's sustainable or not, it's a discussion. But you look at the Edelman, did everyone see the Edelman survey this week on media? Trust in social media is an all-time low. I think it was 22 out of 28 countries, only a minority of people trust the media overall. But there has been a 13-point increase in trust for traditional media. People are shifting back again. Well, we can discuss whether that's sustainable or not. So subscriptions have gone up, and that's quite a good thing to see, but whether it will continue or not. The best way to tell a story, so for philanthropies, credibility, audience reach is key, but also transparency. For us, if we have a relationship with a funder, we make sure that our readers know about it. And increasingly, you're seeing audiences say, well, how do you know this? Where did you get this story from? And you're seeing this increase now in the amount of stories journalists will write about how they actually found that story, to prove the way they found that story has been a transparent, credible way. President's Club this week, everyone knows FT went undercover to go into that room to find out what was going on. And everyone's intrigued, how was the journalism decided to get that story? And people want to know how you get the story because they want to be able to trust that story. And we're going to see that increasing, I think. So philanthropy, that's a good thing. For media, why does the media want to get in bed with philanthropy? Money. The media's strapped for cash, of course. It costs a lot of money to go out and tell stories in the best way. The best way is through people's lives. And the only way to do that is to go out and talk to the people whose lives are being affected, be it in India, Bangladesh, Nigeria, wherever. You need to go and talk to those people. And that's for video and for text as well. And that's expensive. And if you're sitting at a desk writing stories about statistics or data, it can be eye-glazingly dull. And it's not going to give you a really good audience. It's not going to engage the audience. One example on health, which of course is a big issue, particularly for Gates Foundation. We did a story last year, and this is why I got my funders muddled up, on the Chibok girls. Everyone knows the Chibok story, really sad story. Some of them have now been released, and a group of them were in hospital because they've been released and they've got all sorts of health issues from their time in captivity. So we went and we spoke to a girl called, 27 she is now, called Naomi Adamu, she is, and she was in hospital and she needed a kidney operation, but her parents of course couldn't afford it, the school wasn't paying for it, the government wasn't paying for it, so she's just sitting in hospital waiting for this treatment that no one could afford. So we did the story about Naomi, and it highlighted the situation of several other Chibok girls who were also in hospital waiting for operations or medical treatment. And the Nigerian foundation, the Mohammed Foundation, came forward, and they've now funded the health treatment for all of those girls. So again, highlighting real lives can lead to change. Investigative, as Nienke mentioned, investigative journalism costs money, but also takes a lot of time. So for good investigative or in-depth journalism, you need to have the funding and the ability to be able to do it. We did a story last year, year before last it was now, on the mica industry. Mica is that sparkly mineral that's used in makeup and car paint. And it's done, a lot of mica comes from India. And everybody knows that child labour is used in mica. So I sent 3 of my reporters to the 3 main mica-producing regions of India to find out, okay, what's going on, how bad is this problem, knowing that child labour is being used. And a lot of these mines now in India, they're illegal mines. And we found that children were working in the mines, but worse was the children were dying in the mines. But nobody was reporting the deaths because often this is the only industry in that area. And so to close the mines means a loss of income for these families, and so they would rather take a payout for the mine owners than actually report it to the authorities. So my team, they found 7 deaths in 2 months. We've no idea what the real number is. We spoke to the families whose kids have died, we spoke to the mine owners, we spoke to the governments, we spoke to everybody. And this investigation overall took us about 4 months, with video, with pictures, with text, and giving everybody the right to reply in the story, everybody involved. After our story came out, Volkswagen announced that it was going to review all its mica suppliers from India. The Jharkhand government launched a commission into it to find out what was going on and try and change the situation. It can, again, good journalism can lead to some sort of change. The other thing we try to do, which is important as journalists, is to try and keep an issue in the headlines. And that's expensive. Often you get the headlines for 2 or 3 days after some disaster's happened, people move on, you forget all about it. The Nepal earthquake, anyone remember when that was? 2015. 9,000 people died, 500,000 homes were destroyed. It was a massive, massive disaster. It was in the headlines for maybe a week, 2 weeks. Now you think, Nepal, when was that? Everyone's forgotten about it. So we try and go back once or twice a year after a disaster like that and say, okay, what's happened to the electricity? All those people without homes, the kids who haven't got schools, what's happening? We went back, the last trip we did was last October, and only 1/5 of the destroyed homes have been rebuilt. And that's over 2 years later. So you need money to be able to go back and keep a spotlight on those sorts of issues. So to sum up, I think we're in a unique situation at the moment. I think philanthropy and the media can work together very well. We've got, 65 million people now displaced around the world. We've got a migration crisis going on that hasn't been seen before. We've got growing inequality and poverty. We've got rising radicalisation around the world. And we've got the SDGs. We have had a commitment from countries that we will do something by 2030. But to make sure that they do, we have to make sure the pressure's on them. And I think that's where philanthropy and the media can come together to try and keep these things in people's awareness and people's discussions. Shall I stick to my 8 minutes?
It's brilliant. Thank you. Not just in terms of timing, but what you had to say. And thank you, Belinda. And in Miguel's piece, he refers to how philanthropy at its best is at the forefront of the quest for social justice, but media at its best is at the forefront of halting the biggest abuses. And I think what you've been describing is an example of how media can illuminate and actually address and redress some of those abuses. And thank you for that very kind of powerful perspective on what the potential is if only we can ensure that there's good models and good funding of journalism, good quality, reliable journalism. So thank you, and thank you all to the panelists for their perspectives. We're over halfway through the discussion, so I want to hold back any questions I have and really open the floor to your perspectives and your questions. So please do raise your hands. We kicked off with two men for this panel, so I'd like to kick off with two women from the audience. We'll start with Mary there, and then the lady in front of her afterwards. Thank you.
Hello, hi, I'm Mary Fitzgerald from Open Democracy. A couple of you touched on filter bubbles and echo chambers, and I wanted to ask all of you what work you've come across or funded or just know about, which you think is the most promising in terms of challenging filter bubbles and echo chambers. I mean, I take great comfort from the bump in subscriptions to the New York Times and ProPublica, but I don't see any evidence that that's reaching outside of a certain circle of consensus. I don't think someone who voted for Donald Trump is going to be the kind of person that signs up for a New York Times subscription. So it'd be interesting to you're all kind of looking at a lot of the cutting edge work that's done in this area, to hear what you think are some of the most promising innovations on reaching outside of the circles of consensus that we are being pushed into in a strange way by membership models and by subscription drives and all the rest. Thanks.
Thank you, and before you answer that, if you have your questions, stand up and say which organisation.
Patricia Hamzadi, from Black Cultural Archives. It's kind of on a similar vein, actually, because most of the conversation so far has really focused on the credible sources of authoritative media, those so-called representatives of the global elite, etc. And I'm interested, about the will to fund from philanthropic institutions those new sources of news and reporting. For example, I know Ezra Al-Shafei, who has CrowdVoice, which is this amazing crowdsourcing platform that empowers people on the ground to report the abuses that they have and document abuses, as they see it. They're the witnesses and they're the voices, and they're there on the ground, not being filtered through reporters, etc. But right there, they did get some funding from MEDR, but things like that, which are allowing the non-traditional but eyewitnesses to come forth. And so again, those descriptive sources of news, are they fundable in your eyes and should be encouraged, which I would say yes.
So, Miguel?
Yeah, so on the first question, I think that's fundamentally a problem, because the best that we can point out right now is research that is being done to understand the issue at hand, and it's the Social Media and Political Participation Lab out of New York University, and it's Philip Howard work at the Oxford Computational Propaganda Project, and then a bunch of other individual researchers across the world, mostly Europe and the US. But I think that the response so far from philanthropy has been fairly traditional. So increasing media literacy programs. We are, as a sector, obsessed with the question of trust in media, and there is a significant amount of money and efforts going into trust as a concept going on in the US with a commission, and there's another commission coming up. But if you ask me about a project that is as sophisticated as it is in targeting filter bubbles, echo chambers, and all of the conditions that are necessary for that, I can't point out to more than one or two. So we keep saying that we're in a learning phase, but I think we're pretty clear in the magazine that right now neither philanthropy nor media has the sophistication and the tools to combat misinformation and disinformation, and all of that comes from the automatization and of the transmission of information. So we need to address that really, really quickly.
What about Mary's other point, though, that sometimes the subscription processes of these news outlets actually can exacerbate the extent to which you're actually within your own bubble?
Yes.
What is that?
It is true to a point. So I wouldn't be able to argue against that. But in the meantime, what we do know is that, and that this connects with the point of the second question, what do we know is that the influence of the political and social agenda still comes from authoritative, mostly traditional news media and television. So we're not in a position to abandon one from the other yet, because we only know that there is a problem, and every day that passes we know a little bit more about the problem, but we don't have, our solutions are so mid to long term that we can't compete with the real time and automated scale problem that we face with information disorder at large, not just filter bubbles and echo chambers, but the whole picture. Yeah.
Well, it's an excellent question, Mary. It's the one that I think everybody in philanthropy is struggling with, and probably most people outside of philanthropy as well. And as if my foundation and its story shows anything, is that filter bubbles have been around forever. So it's nothing new, and it's nothing we'll ever completely resolve. But of course, the digital disruption and the fact that now all these voices are being heard, and the algorithms that are used by social media amplifies this hugely. So I think there are counter movements, but I haven't seen anything too extraordinary so far. I think we are in a learning phase, and it's not so strange. It's very human to stay in a bubble. There are some interesting projects that I saw. There's this outlet that used to be in Russia, by Galina Tinchenko, I forget her last name. She used to run Lanta.ru, and she now runs Medusa. And they do a lot of gamification, which is mostly aimed at young people, but where you actually bring news stories and substantial and useful information through gaming, which seems to be working. So these are interesting experiments. I don't have anything else to say about that, but we'll keep working on it and funding things that work on it. As for, I forgot your name, but from the Black Cultural Archives, Patricia?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, lovely that you're here. We fund the Black Archives in the Netherlands, so I'd love to talk to you afterwards. They are brilliant. And they've told me about you as well. We don't do any funding of sort of on-the-ground reporting. Also because we're small, so we need to make our niche, and this is simply not it. Of course, you've got Witness, who does a lot with that. But what we do is that we've launched several calls on increasing what is called diversity in media, but perhaps it should be inclusion in media, because diversity is such a complicated word. What does it mean really? But there was research in the Netherlands that only 3% of people in Dutch newsrooms are what we then very blandly call non-white, whatever that may mean. But of course, it's a very homogeneous, I don't know how you say that word, lot, basically. And also the people that you then see on television that are promoted as experts on healthcare or anything else are often the same white males, or perhaps white females that come from the same privileged background. So this is something that is also very, has been around for a very long time. What we do is we've set as one of our goals to create a more level playing field. So we fund various initiatives of people, which we refer to as people of colour, but of course that's also a very broad way of putting it. But we do fund a lot of these initiatives of people that are trying to get their voices out there, trying to get their voices heard, but aren't able to climb on that ladder because for various reasons that they're not allowed in the room, or when they are in the room, the culture of the room doesn't allow them to speak out. So we fund various initiatives that bring diversity to newsrooms, that bring diversity to the public debate. And the increase of applications, and really good applications that we've had since we've started that, is incredible. So I hope more funders will do that.
And the point about diversity in the media is also a big one for philanthropy. Our last issue, but one was about the lack of diversity and the makeup of philanthropic foundations, particularly the representations of the boards. White and wealthy was the headline of one of the pieces about our foundations and their boards. Before we go back to you for some more questions, just Belinda, do you want to comment on the second question, just about that ability to get unmediated voices from different parts of society heard, and your responsibility for that? You touched on it in your comments.
Well, I think all media organisations are looking increasingly at innovative ways to tell stories and trying to get a wider audience. So whether that's using social media, and multimedia is such an important part now. And most media companies have found that trying to get eyeballs on videos is incredibly difficult. But video is such a powerful component, particularly for the younger generation who do, if everyone's got teenagers, that's how they consume news and information. They like videos, they watch YouTube, be it cuddly cats or dogs or whatever. But they do tend to like videos a lot. So everyone's experimenting more and more with video. And also because now with technology, you can. And people can use their iPhones at the go, it can be just a short snip, it doesn't have to be so professional. We are seeing this sort of citizen journalism style come through, which I think we're going to see more and more.
Thank you.
One point on the authoritative mainstream media versus niche or topical or in non-Western countries, etc. So there is a data point hidden in all of this magazine that is that out of the very small percentage of funding that goes to media out of philanthropy, only 3% of that goes to commercial entities, so 97% of it, so it's a small portion of the whole package, goes to non-for-profit. So I personally argue the opposite. I would argue that we need to increase that 3% because of the authoritative role of a number of publications that are mainstream, undoubtedly. I think that philanthropy need to work with those a little bit more than we do right now. 3% seems to me a very small number.
And isn't it not for profit? The problem is audience reach, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, it's trying to get that audience. Often they don't have that reach.
So the tantalising prospect of philanthropic foundations funding for-profit commercial journalism as well as
Well, we do it.
non-profit arm, increasingly
Yeah.
with that, increasing that 3% figure. I'd like to take more perspectives. Start with you, we'll take 3 and then we'll come back to them.
Hi, I'm Caroline Deal. I'm the founder and now chair of what used to be called the Community Channel. It's just rebranded last week as Together. That's a UK-wide TV channel that has an audience of about 9 or 10 million viewers a year. But it reaches very much into sort of ordinary Middle England, the kind of Mirror readers and the Daily Mail readers and just the kind of people who watch daytime telly and things like that. So it's quite interesting. But we turned it into a cooperative last year, so it's actually owned now by its viewers, by its members, by a few charities, by whatever. So it's quite an interesting model, and whether we can get to the scale of the Guardian's contributions from their readers or the New York Times would be interesting to see in the future. But I wondered what you think as a panel, especially your thoughts. What Thomson Reuters has done is amazing, and to a certain extent what BBC Media Action does is amazing outside the UK. Can you see a situation where Google, Facebook, ITV, the Mail, these commercial media companies actually seriously invest properly and cash, because they put quite a lot of pro bono support behind various initiatives, but where they seriously set up foundations that are semi-independent, as the Reuters Foundation is semi-independent, and are really putting money back into new voices, because they talk the talk about all this very well, about diversity and wanting to hear voices and things. Can you see a situation where you, as sort of established philanthropists who are investing in media, can work with us together to really get these big media companies, commercial media companies, to put cash into a foundation model?
Thank you. I'll come to that in a moment. Take your
Thanks.
question.
I'm Mark Galloway, the director of the International Broadcasting Trust. I want to return to this point about audiences and actually television. So I think, Belinda, you said in your presentation we mustn't preach to the converted. But I think the converted do need good evidence, and that should be one of the audiences. But should we be trying to reach mainstream audiences? And that's in a way what Caroline's talking about. And if we want to do that, well, the best way to reach mass audiences in the UK is television. So I just want to interrogate this about target audiences. I'm also interested to ask you, Miguel. You're well known for funding Guardian development, and in terms of audiences, who is the audience for Guardian development, and what kind of impact on that specific project are you hoping that it should have? Is it that you want to change attitudes, or is it that you want to give people in the sector information, or is it that you want to reach a wider audience? I mean, I go on that and I'm never quite clear on who the audience is.
Thank you. And one more question, Juliet?
Hi, I'm Juliet Valdinger. I'm a philanthropy consultant
big broad term. I'm just going to bring up your comment about the SDGs and reaching a new audience, and it's relevant to your comment about gamification. If one is going to reach out to a new audience, and the new audience is a sort of generation, there's a shift, everyone's getting older, and the SDGs are such a topical issue, whether there is a platform to reach out to younger donors, younger philanthropists, and because it's such an appropriate discussion that's going on, and excuse me and please somebody inform me if this does exist, but do you think there's a platform for some media to take that on board for the next 12 years and really report on which firms are doing what, who is doing what, how they are being transparent? Because it will be a topical issue for the next 12 years, and so I would say, certainly I would be really interested to read a regular journal or even a back issue of the FT or whatever it is, which just focuses on who is doing what, are they being met, and to what degree.
Thank you.
Please somebody tell me if that exists, and I don't know that.
Thank you. Do you want to say
Just really quickly, it's not a journalist's report, but I'm part of a working group on impact investing, and that working group is trying to articulate kite marks and a report on companies, investors who are doing the SDGs. So there is some, yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you, and it's good that you'd be able to talk more about that. And if we go, Belinda, with Caroline's question,
Sure.
and maybe you, Nienke, with Juliet's question about the SDGs, and Miguel, the question addressed to you from Mark. That might be the best order.
Okay, sure. On Caroline's question about whether Google, Facebook will get involved, I think the problem is content. Google has Google Labs. They're looking at innovation. They're looking at funding innovation. But for them, funding content, funding journalism is a really difficult one. And I don't think we're going to see them doing that because they have no control over it. And any time you have a relationship as a journalist organisation with a funder, we make very clear, it's in our contract, they have no say in what we write or how we write it. So I think for Google or Facebook to fund content they would have no control over, I think they would struggle with that.
I think they could easily fund, young people, diverse people, whatever, to create content, and they shouldn't have the control over it. That's the whole point. They could be funding, mass,
It'd be great.
The amazing YouTubers and the influencers of the Humzas of this world and people like that.
It would be great. We haven't seen that so far.
Yeah, but I think that pressure and support even from other big philanthropists.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure. I'm not sure if I would want Google to be funding great YouTubers that are then being presented on a Google forum. I think that's a really scary world. I'm not so sure about that.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'm quite happy that Google stays away from content. They fund great innovation.
But how about if you had independence there? They were completely independent, had no say in it.
Nothing really. What is real independence? That's a really big question. I mean, if the money's coming from that, even if they say you're independent, but you know that they're going to stop funding you if you do that, even though they haven't said it.
Well, let's ask Miguel about that, because the Gates Foundation funds Guardian and other media platforms for content that it thinks is important to promote the issues that the foundation cares about, the noble issues, international development, public health. How do you deal with this issue of kind of independence, and maybe also if you can comment on Mark's point about who you're trying to reach?
Yeah. So I said before, we have 3 principles of operation: transparency, independence, and integrity. Within that, it is also true that the foundation operates in a space where we have a number of goals that that have to do mostly with the sustainable development goals. So they are universal goals approved by a number of stakeholders beyond the Gates Foundation. We separate very clearly the work of our external communications colleagues or policy or advocacy from the global partnerships. We have as strong as an internal firewall as it is with our partners. So, and this comes to what I say in my article and in here, and I think is one of the strongest principles that I want to adhere to, and contradicts a little bit of what you said before about what philanthropy can do for media, which is just money. I think that there is a space, and philanthropy works and partnerships only work when there is an alignment, a goal that both organizations aim at. So we take anything from 4 months to a year to talk to media organizations until we find something that we both care about. And sometimes that is a natural, organic conversation that happens very quickly, and there is a topic that we want to do together. And And there's plenty of examples for that. News Deeply is reporting about women empowerment. It took us literally weeks to come out with, oh, this is something that we both care about. With The Guardian, it was when it launched 6 years ago, the Millennium Development Goals, now it's Sustainable Development Goals, 1 to 6, women empowerment. So it has to be something in there that is that Venn diagram with what we want to do as a foundation in terms of impacting the role and the journalism organization wants to do in the responsibility to be also socially relevant. And it has to be something that is not the money, it's something else. Because if it doesn't exist, we don't do those relationships, and I would recommend anyone not to do them because they don't work. It's very transactional. For that, you do sponsored content, or you do something else in which you have a greater control over the content. But if you want to do a grant-making relationship, there has to be a common agreement. So once that is found, and to answer to Mark's question, so you come to an understanding about what you're going to do, and that goes from raising awareness or the discovery of an issue that audiences that this media organization reach don't know about, awareness of something that they didn't know before, to levels of information because you want people to know a little bit more about that, dig into the data and the stories, or knowledge, or even beyond that, in the best case scenarios, changing attitudes and perceptions because it's something that is identifiably negative that you want to influence. So, for example, on all of our partnerships that have to do with gender equality, we have clearly goals that have to do with attitudes towards women and attitudes towards access to health for women in Africa, or access to education for teenagers, etc. So there is an attitudinal and perceptional change that you need to influence. As a media organization, because you play a role in the society where your audiences sit, and as a foundation, because we also have an ultimate goal that can be very specific sometimes. So that brings again another of the points of Mark, which is the question: is it the general public that converted, or is it more narrow audience that you segment? We do both. Sometimes the media organization and us, we understand, in order to benefit the conversation, the debate, raise awareness on this issue, we need to target X audience. And if we know about that audience, we do it in a purposeful and intelligent way. And if we don't, at least we build a community of people interested on the issue that can help sort of socialize the concepts and the solutions. And when we say community, we have a fairly clear definition of what community is. Sometimes it's professionals on the specific field. Sometimes it's just people that come regularly. So there are metrics for that. You know, like there is if a media outlet like The Guardian is an example of global development, what Google metrics call type bookmark. That is that you go to a place because either you type it manually or you have it bookmarked. That is telling us that regularly a significant number of people comes to the pages of The Guardian or El País, as a section in Spain called Futuro, or News Deeply, Women Empowerment, or Le Monde Afrique, all of our partners. We try to encourage that, building that sense of community in which people can go a little bit beyond the sharing, but also take into their own sort of social networks to talk about these issues, and if possible even to do some actions. So in terms of the actual actions, not many organizations are really willing to do that, but we have tested it with a few on very specific issues like homelessness in the US with The Guardian US, where some very specific actions were led from the consumption of the journalism. So yes, you need to understand your audiences, and you need to understand the topic that you want to influence our audiences, but that has to be done in agreement with the media partners, and if it doesn't happen, we don't do it.
Well, I'd very much like to come back to that point about independence and power, and I've got some questions of my own, but I'd like to bring at this moment Saskia from the Odessian Foundation.
Yeah, Saskia, Odessian Foundation, we're one of the few other funders of media work in the room, as I understand from the show of hands. And I wanted to bring a slightly different perspective. Miguel, you mentioned if there's no alignment on the content, I don't know if exactly that is what you meant. It's difficult to have a productive relationship between a funder and media outlet, and I want to question that a little bit, because I think there's other ways to fund media or fund journalistic work because of the value of the work that they bring, the truth that they are, or the quality of the information that they are creating in itself can be a very good reason why you want to fund journalistic work, regardless of the content of that work. And I think at the Deshing Foundation we try to do that, and sometimes we go into more content-driven work, but I think we also have to be really careful about it. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that slightly different.
And I can see a few people nodding in the audience. Is there anyone else that would like to comment on that point about the principle of funding media for its own sake, as opposed to a more instrumental approach to fund it to promote engagement with particular causes? Gentleman there,
yeah, to come on to that, also one of the things that's come up from time to time again has been risk, really. So risk for funders in funding things that may fail, and also risk on the part of journalists and media organisations in receiving funding from particular institutions. And really, wherever you look, whether it's a philanthropic foundation, whether it's a government, whether it's a tech company, or whether it's a high net worth individual, as a media organisation, all of those carry different risks. And one of the things we've also seen is there aren't that many philanthropic funders in the space still, despite this very specific situation that we're in. I want to ask the panel whether you have seen any indication that large-scale collaborations between funders at a high level to increase the scale of funding in the space is likely to occur, because to me that seems to be the thing that at a stroke reduces the risk on the part of the funder in some ways, but also on the part of the recipient of the funding.
What's your name and organisation?
I'm from Open Democracy, Tom King.
Great, thank you, Tom. Would the panel like to respond to Tom's point and Saskia's point?
Sure.
Maybe Nienke, you go.
Should I go first?
Yeah,
okay. But the question was really
And then
to
for
Miguel.
Yeah.
So you go first.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yes, there is absolutely no question about it. I've been in the Gates Foundation for 6 years. Before that, I was with the Open Society for 8 years doing exactly that. So there are environments and there are conditions that in which direct support from media organizations, so that there is a freer flow of information where citizens are informed to make the right choices. Fundamental, no question about it. We in the Gates Foundation, we have a different approach. I think there's room for many approaches. The Gates Foundation has a massively aspirational goal and maybe 30 or 40 different very aspirational goals. So we're very strong on prioritizing and making the right choices for the money that we have, which is fairly sizable, but it's still a really tiny portion of what is needed. So it's mostly about prioritization, but there are other donors who do it, and we're perfectly fine with that. And I personally did it in the past, so no question about it. It's just not our strategy.
It might be completely obvious to the audience, but there are, of course, different reasons for foundations to fund journalism and media. We fund journalism for journalism's sake. That doesn't mean we don't think about audience engagement and impact, because we should, because you can have great journalism, but if nobody reads it, the impact's rather low. Even though perhaps then still you would fund it because the information needs to be out there, but then you would also fund audience engagement kind of organizations. And then there's the kind of foundations that fund journalism because it helps them with a cause that is closer to their mission statement. And I think one of the things that Miguel's told me in the past is that Gates can take a really long time to set a contract between a media organization, because you want to make sure that the power dynamic is right and that you really are aligned. But there are also lots of foundations, not lots of, but there are foundations out there. Anja Schifrin warned about this in her paper with SEMA, Strange Bedfellows, I believe it was called. Very interesting read, about how if you're a foundation and you fund a rather small media organization because you would like them to report on a certain topic, and the person that you're talking to is and the editor and the person responsible for money, and then the foundation talks to that person, there is a power dynamic there that's rather complicated and perhaps also, well, I wouldn't, that's very complicated and that you should be careful about. Now there are firewall organisations such as the European Journalism Centre, and I think there's the Journalism Fund.eu. There's various sort of in-betweens that as a funder you could then fund that, and they will then help you fund journalism on a certain topic by, for example, putting out a call. So there are different ways to navigate this power dynamic. But we fund journalism for journalism's sake, and as does Adesium, and Adesium does so really well because of Adesium's funding. The International Consortium, I always forget what they're called. The Panama Papers group basically was able to grow in the way that they did and produce the journalism that they did. And that's one small thing that I wanted to say that sort of sticks with the discussion that was on earlier about, yes, of course, Belinda, journalists want money, and they should. And I was a grantee of my foundation before I became the director, so I understand very well why foundations are interesting. But now, as a director, of course, I want to be more valuable than just having money. So there's, it's not just that. But basically, what I've found is that as a funder, you can connect people, and you need to do so carefully because, of course, you don't want them to feel that they're forced to then collaborate because you'll stop giving them money if they don't. But you can connect people because you've got such an oversight, so you can bring people in touch with each other. And when it comes to creating a level playing field with smaller organisations, for example, more grassroots kind of journalism or different kind of journalism, you can also help with what's rather patronisingly called capacity building. So instead of just giving them funding for a project, helping them along the way, connected to the right people, perhaps if they need training, funding extra training alongside the project grant that you've been given. So there are different ways as a funder that you can look into funding media journalism.
I think very well observed. But just make one observation as my own, as editor of a magazine, relatively small funding, covering philanthropy, but relying on funds from foundations. So however hard it is for media organisations to rely on funding for their work, when you're actually covering foundations, the risk of self-censorship for someone in my position is even higher. And the need for that more independent capacity building funding is even greater, but often harder to come by. And I'll just briefly say, we're at Alliance, you can see on the back cover the kinds of foundations that support us. There's a large number, which means no funder is in overall control, and that helps us because we can afford to take the risks and be independent. But I would be dishonest if I said that there isn't a risk of self-censorship when I think about how critical we can be of the foundation field and foundations who we rely on in order to be able to function. And I think in that sense there's no absolute independence for anyone, but we rely on the enlightened funders, the enlightened despots, as Gustavo Garetti calls it, who recognise the need for the mirror that a specialist magazine can hold to the sector, and it's probably true in other spaces as well, but an ongoing challenge that I've noticed. Maybe, Melinda, you'd like to contribute from your perspective?
Yeah, sure, and I think I'll just go back onto the money in journalism. Media's not just about money. They need the money for covering issues that don't get any finances. And financial journalism doesn't need money, for example. They make a lot of money. But covering these underreported issues about poverty, discrimination, inequality around the world, that does need funding because otherwise they won't get covered. So it's not just about the money, it is about the causes, and that's the important thing, I think. And I think you're right, though, you can't just take funding from one organisation. We are seeing more groups. We are seeing foundations, unlike the Gates Foundation, which is huge and can go on its own, a lot of smaller foundations do feel more comfortable getting together in some sort of consortium for funding a certain thing, because then the risk is spread a bit. And we're seeing that increasing. I think it is rising now, as you mentioned.
Is that what you meant, Tom, that that there's a consortium of funders that pool funds together, or do you mean that there's more collaboration between them?
I was wondering whether you'd seen that happening, but also whether there's been a step change in the scale of that.
Well, there's the news integrity.
That seems to be a key aspect of scaling journalism worldwide, full stop.
There have been initiatives. The News Integrity Initiative is one of them, and I think there was recently Jennifer Brandel of Herken also mentioned something on Medium. There's the European Solidarity Fund. So this is definitely happening. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of pooled funds because oftentimes the governing board of a pooled fund makes it even harder to make decisions, which is not the best way to fund something as urgent and as sort of snappy as journalism and media. But maybe they'll do great things. And if you create an independent foundation that has a good decision-making power, that's fine. There is, however, something I did want to mention is that at the Democracy and Media Foundation, and together with Miguel and also the Adesium Foundation and a few others here in Europe, we've been trying to set up regular meetings of media funders to see if perhaps there's a more structured way to work together and to inspire and inform each other, perhaps create an umbrella organization. So there are some steps being made in that direction. I'm not sure if that's what you meant.
Thank you. Gentleman opposite me, if you make a brief comment, and then the woman here, and then we'll just go for some final reflections. We're going to run out. Thank you.
Consultant working with foundations on this very issue.
Speak
up. There is observably a big change in interest from funders of all stripes, human rights funders, transparency, accountability, social justice across the spectrum, I think because of the last couple of years noted. So I think there is a big capacity gap between most funders who don't have media specialists on board. They don't have access to specialists on tap, if you like. They don't really have access to, because the media funders themselves have not been that organised, if you like, and don't, in the US they're very organised in some respects, but elsewhere they're not. So that capacity gap between funders who are non-traditional media funders and the ones who are much more experienced, like the ones who have been panel today, is, I think that's one of the major sort of things that needs to be addressed. I think it's excellent that the media funders are beginning to meet informally, and potentially there'll be a more formal structure that comes out of that. But I think the big question is going to be how that gap is bridged to other non-specialist funders who have an inclination to fund but don't necessarily want to do it through pooled funds or other sort of aspects. And there's, I think, a lot of untapped potential for journalism and media funding through a lot of those other kinds of foundations. That's, I think, this year's big task.
And it would be interesting for us and others to revisit the issue in the years ahead to see how that space grows between more established funders like yourselves and new funders that may come into the space.
But having such an organisation can be a way, if we structurally organise media funders that are funding media and then create sort of a space for other funders to join and be curious and hear the learnings that come from that, that could be a great way of, sort of having more people come in and join.
In the US, I think it's 1,300 foundations. Small to medium foundations are organized around something called the Media Impact Funders, and they meet regularly, have workshops, precisely because of that.
And there is, actually Germany is quite organized around this. In the Stiftungen, there's what's called an Expertenkreis, and they have 120 foundations that already meet on these issues. And they're sort of beginning, now they've had 3 meetings, and they're now opening out to the field a little bit more, and inviting experts from the field in to talk to foundations and so on. So, it is possible to do it.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Final comment?
Yes, I'm Robin Heller, and my firm helps organizations to raise funds. And I wanted to make a comment and invite your perspective on something, and to say that it's informed by having worked for a number of years with the Center for Public Integrity and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists as their development professional in working with many foundations around securing funds to be able to do the journalism. And so about 60% of my clients now are journalism organizations, which I say only that they wrestle with the issue, of course, of how do you create a bright line between a funder and the journalism. And over time, what we've done is to create for many of them gift acceptance policies. But what I want to invite your perspective is that it seems to me like it's a combination of 2 very meritable codes of ethics that are encountering one another. The important ethic of journalism and the important ethic of honoring the donor. And both of those are professional, those are very meritable codes of ethics. When we have these conversations about securing funding from a foundation, those 2 codes of ethics do touch one another. And sometimes you have to make a judgment call. In my view, that judgment call is that the journalism needs to be paramount. And we honor our donors, but it's from a point of view of parity, that we have something that a nonprofit that does journalism has something that's very precious. And as foundations, you're looking for partners that are deserving of your expertise, and finding a good grantee is as challenging as finding a great foundation. But as you think about codes of ethics, again, both are very meritable. How do you balance those 2 codes of ethics?
That relationship between donors and grantees is such a characteristic of all philanthropy, maybe particularly hard in this space between philanthropy and the media. And, maybe just invite some just very brief reflections on either Robin's point or generally from the panelists before we wrap up. I'll start with you.
So, you know, we cover certain specific issues, and so when we're looking for funders, we're looking for funders in that space who are going to work with us. We are, as Miguel said, we're sort of on the same sort of mission about raising awareness on these critical issues we feel don't get enough attention. And so we wouldn't be taking money or funding from an organisation we didn't feel fitted very well with our principles of fair, accurate, impartial, integrity, independence. We wouldn't be taking it. So for us, it's very difficult to work with corporates, for example. That's something we haven't done, we wouldn't feel very comfortable doing. Foundations are different, particularly if they're interested in the same topics that we're interested in. So that's where we come together.
I'd say that, you know, I very much subscribe to what Belinda says, but not everybody has that privilege to be able to be picky about the funding that you choose to then accept. I mean, if you're very much struck for cash and you feel that what you're doing is important and must be done, then perhaps you won't be as picky about the kind of money that you'll accept. That's something that I feel foundations should be very aware of, and that, again, organising media funders and creating these codes of ethics and perhaps handbooks, all of this is happening at the moment. I mean, Samir's working with Ariadne, and the European Journalism Centre has been organising funders forums, so there's a lot happening, and I feel in the next coming years this will be structured in a better way that will prevent these kind of skewed power dynamics. And I'm very happy that you all came to listen to this panel today, because this also is very telling of how this topic is becoming more important to people. One last remark from me, you know, we almost exclusively fund in the Netherlands, just saying.
So the only thing that I can add to all of that is that most of those codes of those relationships are on the basis of implicit agreements. So one of the things that I've been working hard and one of the reasons that led us to fund the American Press Institute work on ethics and philanthropic funding back in 2016, or the Journalism Funders Forum that Nienke referred last year and it's going on still this year, is to make those explicit. So to have a code that is, I don't know, 10 commandments that we all sign off, and we are very clear about it, because I think there is universal agreement in 5 or 6, like transparency, obviously, editorial independence. There's some that are paramount and no one will question. But when we get to the 7, 8, 9, 10, it gets a little bit into gray areas. So if we can be very explicit about those, and relevant institutions for both philanthropy and journalism come together and put it in paper, and then we all sign off to them, so we have something to refer to as a code of ethics. That would be fantastic. That would be fantastic. But we don't have it yet. So there is a draft going on in the US, but it hasn't been as publicly discussed as it should. Yeah.
Oh, well, we'll certainly watch this space, and I'm conscious it's 10:30 and therefore time to wrap up this discussion. I hope the conversation today has given you a flavour of what philanthropy media can do, covering what foundations are doing, their engagement with the media, looking at the role that foundations can play, the resources they can bring to the table, some of the risks, some of the power dynamics. And I hope it's given you a sense of the potential for the philanthropy media space to grow in terms of philanthropic funding of the media too, and the issues that they'll have to navigate. We'll obviously need your support to do that, so please, if you don't already, do subscribe to our magazine, as well as follow the progress of these three impressive people and their organisations as well. I'd like to end just by thanking the Alliance team, Catherine, who's behind the camera for the last time for Alliance, Amy at the back, and our editorial intern Emily, who have helped put together today's session. Particularly like to thank our exceptional contributions from the panel, from Belinda, from Nienke, and from Miguel, and for your contributions to the issue. In particular, Miguel, it's been a very interesting process working to bring some of this cutting-edge discussion about philanthropy in the media to a wider community, and Nienke's support in enabling us to lift the paywall so that the issue can be more widely shared, talking about metrics of impact.
Even though people should pay for journalism and media, but okay, fine.
And last of all, I'd also like to thank all of you for making our work possible and for contributing to a kind of stimulating debate that will be set to continue. Our next issue and Breakfast Club will be on diaspora philanthropy. in March. That's our next issue, and we'll be over at the Al Khatam Foundation's Mosaic Rooms over in Earls Court for that conversation in April. But until then, look forward to your feedback, to staying in touch, and please join me in thanking our exceptional panellists for their perspectives today.